Hey everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Intro to American Studies. It's hard to believe that almost a month has gone by, and I hope you're all finding some sort of groove with your work by this point. So this week's reading is from Donna Murch's book, Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. And I actually have a copy right here. And this is a great read for anyone who's interested in education, Black radical politics, social movements, or post-war US history in general. And aside from the subject matter, which I'll talk about in a minute, I chose this book because the author, Donna Murch, is an amazing colleague of all of ours here at Rutgers. She was a key organizer and host of the Speak Out for Black Lives that took place earlier this semester, and I'm pretty sure she's co-teaching a class about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement this semester. She's also very involved in our faculty union, and I was actually in a meeting with her a few days ago. So last week in Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, we learned about the early 20th century roots of racist policing and the fight against it. And Professor Murch's work follows this story about race and policing into the post-war era. As an aside, by post-war, scholars generally mean the decades following World War II, and World War II ended in 1945. So by post-war, we're generally talking about the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And to some degree, folks might argue we are still living in the post-war era. That's a question for another time. So if you're interested in the relationship between race, policing, and social movements in the post-war era, you should definitely reach out to Professor Murch or try to take one of her classes. So why did I pick this book specifically? Well, I study the history of education, particularly as it relates to race and racism. So this book relates to my core area of interest and expertise, and it's one of my favorite books I've read in grad school here at Rutgers. And it's one of my favorites because it's such a great example of the sorts of creative interdisciplinary questions that scholars ask. So Murch asks how higher education and migration were relevant to the founding of the Black Panther Party. And I had never even thought about the relationship between these three things. And neither had most people, which is why the book has been so groundbreaking. She's combining a history of higher education, a history of social movements, and an urban history of the Bay Area and the role of Southern migrants to it. And so it's all history, but she's bringing together these very different areas of history that are usually considered separately together into this one story and book. And Murch's work expands my understanding of Americans by revealing how the specific backgrounds of activists, where their families are from, where they went to school, are relevant to their political work. She shows how the early organizers of the Panthers, most famously Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, were part of the massive post-war migration of Black Americans from the South to northern and western cities. And she shows how this heritage and their memory of their ancestry in the South profoundly shaped their politics. So it was incredibly alienating for these young people to escape racism in the South only to find different forms of racism out west. And in response to this profound and enraging disappointment, they turned to the South for political inspiration in the form of the emerging Black Power movement. She also shows how the massive expansion of California's public higher education system in the early 1960s created a space where working class Black people could come together and learn and organize around common issues. And both Newton and Seale came out of these student activist circles to form the Black Panther Party. And you have to keep in mind that one of the things that really distinguishes the post-war era from earlier in US history is that this is the first time we really see college being accessible to large numbers of working class people. And Murch shows how this vast expansion of college access shaped social movements in this era. One particularly fascinating aspect of this book, I think, is the contrast between activists' personal lives and their public persona. So even though Newton and Seal came out of these student activist circles, they adopted a style and a rhetoric that was very of the streets. And they ultimately worked to organize folks who didn't have access to the types of education that they had. So the Panthers were very carefully crafted a public image that was not your typical idea of a college student. Instead, they rooted their image in their Southern heritage with the panther, which was first used for a black political party in Alabama, and in their strategy of armed self-defense against state violence, so with guns and berets. And so even though the Panthers are often portrayed as sort of men with guns, as stated in the title of the chapter, Murch shows that the founders were highly educated intellectuals who applied their knowledge to their particular experience as post-war black Southern migrants to California. And thinking about today, this book makes me wonder, what might be the educational and or migratory roots of today's Black Lives Matter movement? Are there particular college campuses where student activists laid the foundations for the Black Lives Matter movement? Did movements of black people around the country or around the world play a role? And it makes me concerned because investment in public higher education has been shrinking even before the pandemic, and it's only gotten worse. And so might the foundations of future social movements be diminished if we diminish access to higher education? As a note, at the beginning of the chapter, Murch mentions the Watts Rebellion. So for those who might not be familiar, the Watts Rebellion was an uprising in Los Angeles in 1965 in response to police brutality. So it was very similar to the uprisings we've seen all over the country since Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson in 2014, and even more so since George Floyd's murder earlier this year. So as you're reading, keep in mind that the Panthers come out of a political context that's very similar in ways to what we are experiencing now. And the current uprisings are very much a continuation of fights against police brutality in the 1960s. So those are my thoughts on this book, which I hope you enjoy, and I hope you're able to connect with Professor Murch in some fashion. As usual, your reflection and discussion board posts are due by midnight on Sunday, and I will see you all next week.